Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Monday the 4th of March. My name is Brian Liddy and here is the Ukraine update, day 740. Germany's defence minister has accused Russia of conducting an information war aimed at creating divisions within the country in his first comments after the publication of an audio recording of a meeting of senior German military officials. Russian media on Friday published a 38-minute recording of a call in which German officers were heard discussing weapons for Ukraine and a potential strike on Kyiv on a bridge in Crimea, prompting officials in Moscow to demand an explanation. On Sunday, President Volodymyr Zelensky called for Ukraine's Western partners to summon the political will to provide Kyiv with necessary military supplies, or the world will face one of the most shameful pages of history. Zelensky issued his appeal as a US package to provide military and other assistance remains. Forgive me, I'll read that again. Zelensky issued his appeal as a US package to provide military and other assistance remains blocked by disagreements in Congress. The death toll from a Russian drone strike on an apartment building in Odessa on Saturday rose to 12 after rescue workers found another 4 bodies. Among the dead was an 8-year-old girl discovered near the body of her older brother, who had been uncovered earlier. The dead also included a mother who was found holding her baby, as well as a toddler and a second baby. 5 people were injured overnight by Russian shelling on residential areas in Mirnorad and Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, according to the region's prosecutor's office. Forgive my poor pronunciation there. Ukraine's Interior Ministry also reported 1 death and 3 people wounded in the southern Kherson region on Sunday after Russian strikes. People were still queuing up to place flowers on Alexei Navalny's grave in Moscow's Boriskovskoye cemetery on Sunday. The pile of floral tributes is growing despite state intimidation as Russians pay tribute to the late opposition leader. Turkey believes it is time for ceasefire talks to start in Ukraine, its foreign minister Hakan Fidan said at a press conference on Sunday. Fidan said, "A dialogue for a ceasefire in Ukraine should start. That doesn't mean recognising the occupation by Russia, but issues of sovereignty and ceasefire should be discussed separately." The wife of Vladimir Kara-Murza, one of Russia's most high-profile political prisoners, says it has taken 2 years to secure a meeting with the UK government, despite him being a UK citizen. Kara-Murza is serving a 25-year sentence in a Siberian jail, and his wife, Evgenia, said that she only met David Cameron on Friday. Ukraine's border with Poland remains blocked at all 6 checkpoints to trucks because of protests by Polish farmers about the import of grain from Ukraine, according to local reports. State Border Guard spokesperson Andriy Demchenko said on national television that about 2,400 trucks had been waiting to pass the border as of Sunday, according to a report in the Kyiv Independent. Ukraine launched a mass drone attack on the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula early on Sunday, with unconfirmed reports of powerful explosions near the port of Feodosia. Russia's defence ministry said Ukraine launched 38 drones and that its air defences destroyed all of them. It did not say whether any damage or casualties resulted from the attack in a statement on its Telegram channel. The latest from Gaza and Israel. At least 30,534 Palestinians have been killed and 71,920 injured by Israel's military offensive on Gaza since the 7th of October, according to the latest figures from the Gaza Health Ministry. Over the same time period, in its latest briefing, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the OCHA, noted that at least 409 Palestinians have been reported killed, including 103 children, in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. It has not been possible for journalists to independently verify the casualty figures being issued during the conflict. A 16-year-old boy has been shot and killed by Israeli security forces during an overnight raid in the Al-Amari camp in the Israeli-occupied West Bank city of Ramallah, according to reports. Palestinian news agency Wafa also reports that 55 Palestinians were detained overnight by Israeli security forces. The Palestinian Prisoners Society states that about 7,400 Palestinians have now been detained by Israel since the 7th of October. US Vice President Kamala Harris called yesterday for an immediate 6-week ceasefire. She said people in Gaza are starving and that the Israeli government must do more to increase the flow of aid. The conditions are inhumane, she added. Hamas has said it is pressing on with talks in Cairo aimed at securing a ceasefire in Gaza despite Israel's decision not to attend. However, in Beirut, a Hamas spokesperson called on Palestinians to make every moment of Ramadan a confrontation. The deaths of more than 100 people when Israeli forces opened fire near an aid convoy in Gaza was a tragedy that should have been foreseen and could have been prevented, the World Food Programme Director for Gaza, Matthew Hollingworth, has said. Mohammed Shtayyeh, caretaker Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, has accused Israel of systematic criminality, and said countries that support Israel should feel ashamed. In its latest operational briefing, Israel's military claims to have apprehended suspected members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad who were attempting to flee under the protection of the civilian population and to have destroyed a cell who were firing rockets from Gaza into Israel. Family members of those still being held hostages by Hamas in Gaza have staged a silent march today in the Knesset in Jerusalem, demanding their release after 150 days in captivity. Lebanese media reported Israeli airstrikes in the south of the country near the UN-drawn blue line that separates Lebanon from Israel. Earlier, Israeli media reported that one person had been killed and at least 7 wounded by fire from inside Lebanon that crossed into Israel at Margalio. US envoy Amos Hochstein has been in Beirut, where he said that a limited war across Lebanon's southern border would not be containable. In Geneva, Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, described military escalation in southern Lebanon as extremely worrying. Rishi Sunak has suffered 3 defeats in the House of Lords over his Rwanda bill. The government lost the first 2 by majorities of 102, and in the third division, the government lost by a majority of 110. The first defeat on the Rwanda bill came as peers vote by 102 majority to insist it must be compliant with international law. The amendment was passed by 274 votes to 172. That's a majority of 102. The second Lord's defeat came as the government lost a vote on Lord Hope's amendment, which says that the government cannot treat Rwanda as a safe country until the provisions of the UK-Rwanda Treaty have been implemented. It was also passed by a majority of 102. The third defeat followed the government losing by a majority of 110. Further votes are due as the debate carries on tonight, and there will be another report-stage debate on the bill, with votes on amendments on Wednesday. Proposals for how an outward-looking independent Scotland could play its part in tackling global challenges have been published by External Affairs Secretary Angus Robertson. An Independent Scotland's Place in the World, the latest paper in the Building a New Scotland series, sets out the Scottish Government's policy proposals for international engagement and defence policy following independence. These include commitments to apply for membership of the United Nations, European Union and NATO as soon as possible following a vote for independence, the establishment of a dedicated diplomatic network, to promote and protect Scottish interests, provide consular support for Scottish citizens, and promote the country as a hub for innovation, trade and investment. A commitment to meet the UN's target of 0.7% of gross national income, or GNI, on overseas development aid to help the world's poorest countries. The establishment of new armed forces informed by an expert defence and security review with a modern contract for personnel and continued strong support for veterans. And finally, the removal of nuclear weapons from Scotland in the safest and quickest manner possible after independence. Mr. Robertson said, Scotland is already making a contribution on the world stage where we can to address global poverty, the climate and biodiversity crisis, and threats to human rights. But because we are not independent, Scotland has been forced into Brexit and contributing towards billions of pounds being spent on nuclear weapons. If Scotland had full participation in multilateral bodies, such as the UN, we could ensure our voice is heard on critical global issues, such as the Israel-Gaza conflict. He went on to say full representation within associations like the UN and EU would also enable us to negotiate directly to become party to international treaties, conventions and agreements that reflect Scotland's values and ambitions as a good global citizen. These associations and the benefits they would bring, such as regained access to the world's largest single market and freedom of movement within the EU, would also bring opportunities overseas and at home, helping to develop a competitive economy and support education, skills and jobs with our strengths in our culture and innovation industries, as well as renewable energy. He continued, ultimately, independence would enable Scotland to determine the kind of state it wants to be on the world stage. We firmly believe that the challenges of the 21st century are best faced through more, not less cooperation, and I look forward to engaging with as many people as possible on the opportunities highlighted in this paper as we look to Scotland's future. Excuse me. The SNP has warned Scotland faces another decade of devastating austerity cuts under Tory and Labour Party fiscal rules, as the UK Chancellor indicates further cuts to public services and capital investment. Ahead of the UK budget on Wednesday, SNP economy spokesperson Drew Hendry MP challenged the Chancellor to ditch his reckless plans for even more cuts before it's too late. After Westminster cut Scotland's budget by more than £2 billion in real terms for 2023-24, including a £500 million cut to public service budgets and a £1.6 billion cut to capital investment. It comes as former Bank of England chief economist Andy Haldane warned the UK government's fiscal rules are stunting growth. The SNP has instead urged the Chancellor to deliver more money to the NHS, public services and capital investment, calling on Jeremy Hunt to boost NHS spending by £15 billion using the available headroom to improve healthcare after the UK government imposed real-term cuts this year, to turbocharge investment in green energy by investing at least £28 billion a year to compete in the global green energy gold rush and secure sustainable economic growth, to help families with the cost of living by scrapping energy bill standing charges and using a £12 billion wealth tax to fund a £400 annual energy bill discount for households, reintroducing mortgage interest tax relief, capping supermarket food prices, and matching the Scottish Child Payment UK-wide. And finally, to boost public finances by scrapping non-dom tax status, increasing capital gains tax, taxing share buybacks, increasing taxes for those earning more than £100,000, and by investing in renewables and rejoining the EU single market to deliver economic growth. Commenting, SNP economy spokesperson Drew Hendry MP said, "The UK is fast heading towards another damaging decade of Westminster austerity cuts unless Tories and Labour Party scrap their economically illiterate fiscal rules and prioritise investment in public services and economic growth over devastating cuts." Westminster has already slashed Scotland's budget by more than £2 billion this year and imposed real-term cuts to the NHS across the UK. He continued, "The Chancellor must ditch his reckless plans for even more cuts before it's too late. The only way to deliver a stronger NHS and to sustain economic growth is by investing in services and boosting capital investment, yet instead Westminster has been choking growth off and putting public services under threat by cutting to the bone. The UK is now in a doom spiral of ever deeper cuts, cutting off growth and leading to even more cuts. Enough is enough. Excuse me. Social Justice Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville has called for the UK Government to prioritise tackling child poverty and supporting the most vulnerable in society by the upcoming spring budget. In a letter to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Mel Stride, Miss Somerville said the Scottish Government's 2024-25 budget is unapologetically targeting poverty, with a record £6.3 billion in social security benefits committed to support those most in need. This is £1.1 billion more than the UK Government gives to the Scottish Government for social security. She said the UK Government should introduce an essentials guarantee to ensure those in receipt of benefits have enough to meet their basic needs. However, she said this would not be enough on its own, and immediate action must be taken to abolish measures such as the bedroom tax, the two-child limit and benefit sanctions. In the letter, Miss Somerville said, without addressing wider unfairness in the social security system, an essentials guarantee is not sufficient. That is why I continue to urge you to abolish the two-child limit, benefits cap, the bedroom tax and both the young parent penalty and 5-week wait in universal credit. These policies restrict the amount of support available to some of our most vulnerable people, disproportionately affecting women and children, and build unnecessary hardship into the social security system. She went on, it is estimated 100,000 fewer children will live in relative poverty in 2024-25 as a result of Scottish Government's policies, with relative poverty levels 10 percentage points lower than they would have been otherwise. She continued, this demonstrates the considerable impact that our clear focus on tackling child poverty is having in Scotland. I urge the UK Government to follow our lead. SNP leader Humza Yousaf has written a letter to Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar calling for the Scottish Labour leader to clarify his party's policy on tuition fees. In the letter, the SNP leader has asked Anas Sarwar to confirm Scottish Labour's policy on free university tuition fees for students in Scotland. The calls for clarity from Sarwar come following Keir Starmer's U-turn on his own support for free tuition and comments from Scottish Labour's finance spokesperson Michael Mara, which suggests that Scottish Labour would look to reintroduce charges for students who wish to study at university in Scotland. In his letter, SNP leader Humza Yousaf queried Labour finance spokesperson Michael Mara's recent comment on university tuition fees. Excuse me. It was reported that Mr Mara had suggested that Labour will examine models that would reintroduce charges. The First Minister wrote, since the SNP government abolished Labour's backdoor tuition fees in 2007, close to 700,000 students in Scotland have benefited from free access to university. He carried on, the number of Scottish first-time, full-time degree entrants has grown by 31%, and the number of students in our poorest communities is at a record high. Mr Yousaf said that Anas Sarwar's silence on Michael Mara's remarks has been deafening and insisted that young people in Scotland have the right to know precisely what Labour stands for. The letter pointed out that Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has already U-turned on his support for free tuition, and in Labour-run Wales, the cap on university tuition fees is rising from £9,000 to £9,250. The First Minister asked if Michael Mara's comments are now Labour Party policy in Scotland. Abolishing tuition fees is one of my party's proudest achievements, and the SNP government will always ensure that access to university is based on the ability to learn and not the ability to pay, said Mr Yousaf. The Labour Party has announced that under a Labour government there would be no option of a life on benefits, as it set out plans to tackle the number of young people not in work, education or training in England. Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary Liz Kendall said Labour would recruit 8,500 more mental health workers and promised that the sickness benefits bill would fall under Labour, but she did not specify what form the tougher measures on universal credit would take. Under our changed Labour Party, if you can work, there will be no option of a life on benefits, she said in a speech to the centre-left Demos think tank in London. The tough language on welfare, reminiscent of 90s era New Labour, prompted concern about the implications of sanctions for those struggling with mental health issues. She also took aim at what she describes as Tory claims about being tough on benefits and said that over the next 5 years there would be 600,000 more people on incapacity and disability benefits, costing an extra £33 billion. Kendall was challenged in a question and answer session by Ollie Steadman, Policy and Campaigns Manager at the charity Mind. Steadman said afterwards, supporting disabled people to find long-term fulfilling work can only be achieved by taking a supportive approach. Punitive action does not work and only pushes disabled people further into poverty. George Galloway has been sworn in as the MP for Rochdale as Parliament returned for the first time since his by-election win last week. In line with House of Commons procedure, he was accompanied into the chamber by the two MPs who had sponsored him, the Conservative Father of the House, Peter Bottomley, and Alba Party MP Neil Hanvey. George Galloway, who is a staunch unionist, is regarded by many to be one of the most divisive politicians in the UK. He won almost 40% of the vote in last Thursday's vote after a campaign centred on the conflict in Gaza. Mr Galloway was watched from the public gallery by his wife, Putri Gayatri Petriwi, and a small group of others including James Giles, a London councillor who leads the Kingston Independent Residents Party and was involved in the campaign in Rochdale. Galloway held a copy of the Bible as he swore an oath of allegiance to the King before shaking hands with the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, and leaving the chamber. His return to the Commons means he will have represented 5 different constituencies: Glasgow Hillhead, Glasgow Kelvin, Bethnal Green and Bow, and Bradford West and Rochdale. Sorry, that was a bit garbled. I'll read them again. So the 5 constituencies he's represented are Glasgow Hillhead, Glasgow Kelvin, Bethnal Green and Bow, Bradford West, and finally Rochdale. The US Supreme Court has ruled that Donald Trump was wrongly removed from Colorado's primary ballot last year, clearing the way for Trump to appear on the ballot in all 50 states. The court's unanimous decision overturns a 4-3 ruling from the Colorado Supreme Court that said the former president could not run because he had engaged in insurrection during the January 6 attack on the US Capitol. We conclude that states may disqualify persons holding or attempting to hold state office, but states have no power under the Constitution to enforce Section 3 with respect to federal offices, especially the presidency, the court wrote in an unsigned opinion. The court said that Congress had to enact the procedures for disqualification under Section 3. The Supreme Court's opinion went on to say, state-by-state resolution of the question whether Section 3 bars a particular candidate for president from serving would be quite unlikely to yield a uniform answer consistent with the basic principle that the president represents all the voters in the nation. Colorado's presidential primary is on Tuesday, and Trump had been allowed Colorado's presidential primary is on Tuesday, and Trump had been allowed to appear on the ballot while the case was pending. Maine and a judge in Illinois had also excluded Trump from the ballot, decisions that are now likely to be quickly reversed. All 9 justices agreed with the central holding in the case that the Colorado Supreme Court had wrongly barred Trump from appearing on the ballot. But agreement did not extend beyond that. The majority opinion went on to say that the only way to enforce Section 3 was by specifically tailored congressional legislation to determine which individuals should be disqualified for insurrection. None of the opinions addressed a central and politically charged issue in the case, whether Trump engaged in insurrection on January 6th. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which was enacted after the Civil War, says that any member of Congress or officer of the United States who engages in insurrection after taking an oath to the Constitution is barred from holding office. It has never been used to bar a presidential candidate from office. Victims of sexual violence and domestic abuse will be able to access support quicker thanks to an additional £2 million of funding from the Scottish Government. The funding will go to Rape Crisis Scotland and Scottish Women's Aid, so they can reduce their waiting lists for women who need support services, including refuge places and counselling. Last year, both organisations supported more than 27,000 women and girls, but demand for their services has grown. The £2 million for 2024-25 is in addition to the £19 million annual funding the Scottish Government provides to support women with experience of violence through our Delivering Equally Safe Fund. Victims and Community Safety Minister Siobhan Brown said, "Violence against women and girls is abhorrent and these frontline services provide much needed support to victims and survivors." She went on to say, "We recognise the vital work that Women's Aid and rape crisis centres do day in, day out to support women, girls and families. Demand for these services is increasing, which is why we are providing record funding, investing an additional £2 million to help with immediate need. This is in addition to funding received through our Delivering Equally Safe Fund. Alongside supporting those impacted, we are committed to tackling violence against women and girls and addressing the underlying attitudes and systems that perpetuate it through our Equally Safe strategy. It is this that needs to change to eradicate the violence too many experience." A dedicated approach to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, or GBV, in schools has been published. Developed by a working group co-chaired by the Scottish Government, Developed by a working group co-chaired by the Scottish Government, Rape Crisis Scotland and Zero Tolerance, the framework encompasses testimony from young people and staff and sets out how schools can use education, with an emphasis on compassion, to challenge societal views which normalise gender-based violence. It aims to support schools by demanding the different ways GBV can affect young people in a school community and highlighting how schools can challenge the underlying gender inequalities which can cause it, by providing guidance to support schools' responses to GBV experienced or carried out by children and young people or other members of the school community, including staff, and finally by outlining the approach schools should take to recording GBV behaviours and signposting to further support and learning. GBV refers to behaviours ranging from name-calling, intimidation and physical violence to sexual harassment and emotional abuse, which can affect anyone but is more commonly experienced by women and girls. The Behaviour in Scottish Schools research report, published last year, highlighted an increase in misogynistic views and language as an emerging concern in schools, which the Education Secretary committed to developing a dedicated approach to address as part of the Government's wider response to challenges with behaviour in schools. First Minister Humza Yousaf and Education Secretary Jenny Gilruth launched the framework on a visit to Moffat Academy, where they heard about a pupil-led approach to promoting gender equality. The First Minister said, "We want schools to create cultures in which all members of the school community know that gender-based violence is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Prevention and early intervention are key to the approach to address the underlying causes of gender-based violence, particularly gender inequality." He went on to say this framework forms part of our broader action to address the issue of gender equality, with education as part of the implementation of our equally safe strategy and broader commitment to eradicate gender-based violence in every part of our society. Well, that is it for this evening, but before I go, let me just remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford anything, £5 a month, anything at all, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We've now reached our emergency crowdfunder target of £10,000. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our focus will now move on to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So thank you, goodbye, and thank you for watching.